Okay, the second thing that I want to look at, we looked at the brain, we looked at the spinal cord. Now we're going to focus our attention on the sensory receptors. What kind of senses are there? Now, most of these are going to be nervous tissue. There are, as in other vertebrates, there are sensory receptors that are epithelial cells, epithelial tissue. But that's unusual. Most of these receptors are part of the nervous system and they're nerve cells. So let's look at these different types of sensory receptors. Now we're going to look at things like touch and smell and taste and hearing and vision, these different receptors that are prevalent in other vertebrates as well. You could look at these sensory receptors in terms of transducers. Now, you don't have to be that familiar with electronics or what a transducer is, but basically a transducer converts a stimulus from one form of energy to another. So there's a lot of transducers that we deal with. You know, there's a microphone that transmits our voice, air, pressure waves to a sound. And there's loudspeakers that do something similar. There's a thermometer that does something similar. If it's a digital thermometer, converts temperature and heat, which is one form of energy, to another form of energy. Well, those are very common in sensory systems. They're also very common in electronics. A lot of the things that we deal with are basically transducers. Energy comes in one form, and it stimulates a sense organ, or it's picked up by a sense organ, and then that stimulus is converted to a nerve impulse, basically. And that nerve impulse travels to the brain very quickly. A lot of these are very close to the brain, and then the brain interprets that signal. And a lot of times, there's a signal that comes out of the brain back to part of the body. Could be muscle, could be another part of the body, where the signal comes from the brain in response to that energy that's coming from the environment. And by energy in the environment, I mean pressure waves or some kind of chemical signal or something like that. So we're going to look at a number of different sense organs for mechanoreception and chemoreception, photoreception, electroreception. That's what the sense organs are sensing. The energy in the environment or the stimulus in the environment are those different things, chemicals or pressure waves or electric impulses. So that's what we're going to see when we look at these different senses. They're basically transducers. And in terms of sensory receptors, these different sensory receptors that are sensing chemicals, or they're sensing pressure, or they're sensing an electric field, they operate on two different systems, basically, two different levels. First of all is their sensitivity. So you can turn up the amount of electrical stimulus, for instance, from very, very small, and turn it up a little more, and turn it up a little more, and eventually, you get to a point where a shark or skate array can detect that electric field. Same thing with the concentration of chemicals in water, that there's a certain concentration that's too low to be detected, and you add a little more and a little more. It's a very low level, but you get to a point where the animal becomes sensitive to that, or it can sense the presence of this amino acid or an electrical stimulus or a pressure wave. And in this respect, the level of sensitivity is very low for some of these senses. They're extremely sensitive to even minor impulses that are out in the environment. But another aspect of this is the acuity, that you can distinguish between sensitivity. You can tell the wavelength of sound that's coming in. You can discriminate pitch and you can discriminate volume, those kind of things. You're not just sensing something, but you can tell what it is. You can tell how loud it is. You can tell what kind of chemical it is. You can tell what kind of electric field it is. Now that's different than just being sensitive to something. That is acuity. So you can tell where it's coming from by for instance, using both of your ears, you can tell the location of some sound. In air, we can. You can tell what kind of sound it is, how loud it is, what kind of organism it's coming from, or if you have a history of it and a memory of it, if you've processed this information before, you can tell what type of sensory input it is. Well, let's look at these different environmental stimuli, and we can look at what we're familiar with in terms of humans. When you're a little kid, you know, oh, I've got 5 senses: sight and hearing and smell and touch and taste. Those are my 5 senses. But if you think about in the water, then some of these become similar and different than what you experience as humans on land and in the air. For instance, both hearing and touch respond to pressure waves. There's pressure waves that travel through the air that hit against our eardrums, that move bones in our ears, and there's a fluid that moves through our inner ear that our ears sense. And we discriminate those sounds with a certain volume, a certain pitch, and that information goes to our brain, and we interpret those pressure waves as some kind of a noise. Well, there's also pressure waves that we sense with other parts of our body, skin, touch, but it's a similar type of sensation, that it's pressure waves, or it's a mechanical deflection that are either our ears or different parts of our body are sensing. So there's mechanoreceptors, basically, which are both touch and sound. Then there's chemical receptors. You know, we can smell things as chemicals that are in the air become dissolved in the mucus in our nostrils. We can smell those. That's part of our olfactory system. But we can also taste chemicals when they don't dissolve in the mucus in our noses, but they dissolve in the fluids on our tongue, for instance. It's the same thing, though. It's a chemical stimulus. It's detected by some receptor on these sense organs, and it recognizes this type of chemical, and it says, oh, this is this chemical, or it's that chemical. I can smell this, I can taste it. It's basically the same. So if you take that in consideration in water, if you're in water, you know, tasting and smelling, there's no difference, because whatever you're tasting or smelling, these chemicals are both dissolved in water. There is no air to be able to smell things through. So you're basically down to 4 different types of stimuli that come into a shark or skate array. There's mechanical, which could be hearing, or it could be pressure. There's chemical, which we would associate with taste or smell. There's visual, photoreceptors, that is related to light. And then there's this 6th sense that sharks, skates, and rays, and a few other animals have, not very many. It's electrical reception, the ability to detect electric fields. Now, this is completely foreign to us because we don't have this. It's hard for us to imagine how this works. But it's a 6th sense, or if you're joining these chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors together, it's a 4th sense that we don't have. Now, there's other types of sensors, that hunger, pain. You can sense how much time has gone by. There's these different types of receptors that are also found in different organisms. Temperature as well. But those are the main types of stimuli that are coming into a shark or skate array, or those 4. So on Monday, when we come back from class, that's what we're going to do, is delve into a lot more detail about each one of those types of senses. Those are special senses, special sensory receptors that are very acute, very high level of sensitivity and high level of acuity in sharks, skates, and rays. And the point that I made before a number of times is that it explains their success. Some of these haven't changed that much over the 425 million years that sharks, skates, and rays have been swimming around. They work really, really well. Okay, well, let's talk about sensory integration. And by that, I mean you're getting a lot of sensory input. If you're a shark and you're out there swimming around, there might be a fish that's thrashing around because it's injured. It's giving you mechanoreception stimuli. You can hear it. You can hear those low frequency wavelengths from a ways away. Maybe when you get close enough, if you're really close, you can sense the pressure waves, different parts of your body. You're not hearing it, but you're sensing it with your lateral line, these pressure waves that hit against your body. You can smell the amino acids, maybe the blood that are coming off of this fish because it's injured. You can see it thrashing around. It really attracts your attention visually. And then when you get close enough, that maybe there's also this blood that's being lost with all these different electrolytes that are creating an electric current that you can sense with your electroreception. The point is that there's a lot of input of sensory information. Where is this in most vertebrates? If you're swimming along, or if you're walking along, you're crawling along, whatever you do, then the first part of your body that encounters the environment as you're moving forward in almost all these animals is your head. If you've got a head, that's the first thing that encounters the environment as you're moving along. And it senses the environment. It sees things, it smells things, it hears things, it tastes things. That's the first part of your body that enters into a new environment, enters into the water, enters into a room, is your head with all these different sensory apparatus. That's where your eyes are, that's where your ears are, that's where your nose is, that's where your mouth is. And so it makes sense that if you look at where all these sensory systems are loaded up, it's in the head. It's on the head. And it's the head. Another thing about the head is it's a very, very short distance to the brain. From your ears, it's a short distance to your brain. From your nose, it's a very short distance to your brain. From your eyes, it's a very short distance to your brain. So that you can sense this information and transmit those nerve impulses very, very quickly to your brain, and then your brain can respond to those. It doesn't have to go all the way from your fingers, all the way from your toes. You know, there is sensory input from those locations as well. And then the different parts of the brain are receiving different information, and putting all of this information together, you're smelling things. That's concentrated, especially in these elasmobranchs and their olfactory lobes that are in the forebrain. You're seeing things where the sensory input is going into the midbrain, and you're also coordinating movement, and you're detecting these different sensations in the hindbrain as well, the rear part of your brain. So there's sensory input that's coming into all different parts of your brain, and your brain is integrating these and responding to those. Well, if you look at the pathways for sensory input into the brain and the brain responding back, then there's centers, as I said, that are located around different locations of the brain where visual stimuli is being acquired, and you're responding to that as an organism, whether it's one of us, a human, or whether it's a shark. There's different parts of the brain that are receiving different stimuli, and then they're integrating this different stimuli. You're smelling things, you're tasting things, you're seeing things, you're detecting electric fields, and you're responding to this. So some of it is very fast. Some of it is just you're deciphering what it is that you're smelling or you're seeing. Some of it is getting a stimulus and responding to it very quickly. So it goes from the sensory system to the brain and then back for some response very quickly. So if you think about if you're going to respond to a prey, or if you're going to respond to a predator, you're going to have to respond to something very quickly. Maybe it's a female or a male if you're interested in mating at that particular time. So there's also a discrimination between what are these senses telling me and how should I respond, and how far away are the stimuli that are coming in, and what kind of response is needed from me. There's that kind of integration as well. And if you put all these things together, just, this is kind of theoretical, hypothetical, but there's also distances at which these sensory systems work. And so the brain is receiving information from different distances, for the most part, from these different sensory receptors. So here's some of the things that a shark that's swimming around there, here's this fish that's maybe it's injured and it's thrashing around at a certain distance, quite a ways away, thousands of meters. A shark or a skate or a ray could hear those low frequency vibrations. Sound travels through the water very quickly and long distances. So you could hear something from a long ways away. We rely on this number of different types of oceanography, sonar and SOFAR. There's parts of the water column where sound travels thousands of miles. So if you hear something, that's quite a ways away. In this figure, the purple. You get a little closer, you can smell things, and there's usually currents in the ocean so there's an odor plume or an odor corridor that something can follow. It's not, if water's not moving very much, then that sensation or your ability to hone in on where a smell is coming from might not work that well. But most of the time water is moving. And so these dissolved chemicals travel a certain distance, and they form a trail that you can follow to the source of this smell. And you get a little closer, and then there's pressure waves, not that you're hearing, but pressure waves that the rest of your body can sense. So your lateral line and that type of mechanoreception comes into play when you get relatively close, maybe less than 100 meters, certainly, where there's pressure waves that you can sense. And then to be able to see, visibility in the ocean isn't that great, but if you get within a certain distance of whatever it is that you're sensing, then you can rely on your eyes and photoreception. And so maybe that's 30 meters or so. When you can see a prey, you can see a predator, you can see what's going on. If you get much farther away than that, then you can't really see. Same with us when we're underwater. Then you get really close, less than a meter, 30 centimeters. So that's about a third of a centimeter, just a few inches away, maybe a foot. And then there's these electric currents that are being produced, these electric fields that are giving you some sensory input. This is created, as we'll see when we look at this, by a heart beating, by ions coming out of the gills of a fish, things like that. Even water moving, whatever creates an electric field in water. And it's basically ions or electrons that are moving that create an electric field. You have to be really close to be able to sense an electric field. They have this sensitivity. It has to be a short distance in order for them to use that, but it's certainly very sensitive. You can detect things that you can't see. You can detect things that you can't smell. You can detect things that you can't hear through these electric fields. And then finally, if you're touching something, if you're biting it or if you're rubbing against it, then you can actually taste, although that's not much different than being able to smell. But there's some texture, there's some feel, there's some, just like we can bite into something and it's got a certain feel in terms of how it tastes. Obviously, you've got to be very close. So this is the type of hierarchy of those senses that a shark or skate ray might go through, starting from very far apart and be able to hear things, to be getting very, very close, starting to use your electroreception or close enough to actually touch something, bite it, rub against it, in which case you'd use this other type of chemoreception and mechanoreception as well, in terms of the texture of something or how hard it is. So there's a lot of senses that are coming into sharks, skates, and rays. There's the requirement to be able to integrate those senses, and part of